Good afternoon, everyone. This is Kirsten Davis. I am in Gulfport, Florida today, and I'm really happy to have you here for teaching the basics of tribal law in first-year legal research and writing, improving knowledge and skills, promoting inclusiveness and diversity. As I said, I'm going to be your organizer and moderator for the day. That's me there on your screen. For those of you who have never joined us before, I thought I'd take a moment and give you a quick introduction to your question and answer box. You should have, probably on the right-hand side of your screen, a little box that says questions, and down here is where you type a question. It would help me to know that you can hear me, so if you just type into this box where you are listening from, maybe what location you're listening from, and what the weather's like there today. And I'll wait just a minute to see a couple of those come up so I know that you can hear me. Great. Thank you, Sue. Listening from Carbondale on a gorgeous fall day. I am from Ohio, Sue. I absolutely miss the turning of the leaves. So thank you so much. Here's someone in Boston. Hi, Sam. And some colleagues at Stetson listening on campus. Thank you so much for telling me you can hear me. It's always weird speaking into the silence. If you have never been with us before, what you're looking at right now is your viewer window and your control panel. The interface is made up of those two parts, the viewer window usually on the left, the control panel on the right. If you look there, you'll see those two little carrots or arrows. If you click on that, that can move that control panel out of your way like this. And then clicking on it again opens it back up. So if it's in your way and you want to see more of the screen, you can move it like that. If you're having any trouble with the audio setup, click here. That can help you change your volume or change your audio connection. Again, as I mentioned before, the questions area and where you can type in a question for us. We will have a question and answer period, so if you want to type in a question for me at any time that I can share with our presenters at the end of the session, we'll take those questions in the last 15 minutes or so of the webinar. And finally, you can see right here, if you go to that little view screen, and click on and pull it down, you'll see a little check mark next to auto hide the control panel. If that is checked, the control panel will close itself every 10 minutes or so to kind of try to stay out of your way if you're not using it. If you don't want it to do that, all you have to do is hit that check mark right there. Okay, I'll give you a second that if you want to copy and paste or write down that web address right here, if you'd like to access more of our webinars, they are all recorded and are available through our website. Anybody who is in a nonprofit, government, or educational institution, you can click on this link right here, or I'm sorry, write down that link right there, or go to Stetson's webpage and go to the legal writing site and you can access more of our webinars. Okay, so just by way of a short introduction before we turn it over to our speakers, what you see in front of you is the first part of sort of the traditional legal research trail or legal research plan. You can see here at the top generating your research plan and your list of search terms, and then using secondary authorities to look into more about a topic to find primary authority. But oftentimes, and I thank Professor Herrera for designing this research trail, we get to the question, is tribal law or international law applicable? And sometimes that answer can be yes or maybe yes, and we need to locate treaties, statutes, codes, and agreements. For some of our students, they might not even know what tribal law is, and they may only have an inkling of what international law is. So our question for today then is, what is tribal law? And how do we integrate it into our courses to help students locate the sources of primary tribal law and use that law effectively for researching the questions that they'll be using in practice, given that tribal law is fairly prevalent around the country. So today's panelists, I'm really happy to share with you. First is Tamara Herrera, who is a clinical professor of law at Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law at Arizona State. In addition to teaching beginning and advanced legal research and writing courses and property law, she teaches a tribal law research course. And in addition to her JD, Professor Herrera holds her Master's of Information and Library Science from the University of Arizona. So welcome, Professor Herrera. And second, we have Professor Tanya Kowalski, who is a professor of law at Washburn University School of Law. She teaches legal analysis, research and writing, clinical legal writing, and an assortment of tribal law and Indian law courses, among others. She has written on tribal law and sovereignty issues, and her new book, Tribal Court Practice, is a co-authored piece and is forthcoming from Carolina Academic Press. We're going to start today with Professor Kowalski talking to us about the basics of tribal law. Tanya, can you hear me?
I can. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. We can hear you now, and I'm going to turn the screen over to you.
Excellent. All right. And can everyone see my screen with the introductory title? I hope I did that correctly.
I can see it. Great. Thank you.
Excellent. Good. Thank you. All right. Well, hello, everyone. And I can't hear you, so I'm just going to go ahead and get going. And I recently quit coffee, but I had one today, so I'm also going to make myself try to speak slowly, which may be a challenge today. If anybody wants me to slow down or has a question, I think you can use the chat pane to ask Kirsten, and she'll be able to communicate with me. So I'm going to start kind of really from the real beginning. And the reason for that is that I myself really didn't know anything about this topic at all until I was lucky enough to get an entry-level position at Arizona State. And that's where I was first exposed to this topic. And so I really kind of think of myself as being the previous law student that I would be teaching to now. In other words, I wish so much that I had been exposed to this material when I was a student, because I made it all the way through several years of practice and all kinds of goodness knows how many situations I may have committed malpractice in, because I actually had no idea that there was such a thing as a tribal court or that tribes had their own law. I really didn't know that, and it might be partly because I grew up on the East Coast where, at least back then, it wasn't as well known, but I think that that's changing now. So without further ado, the reason why this map is up here is that this is a map from the NAGPRA website. I won't get into what that is, but it's a helpful map, and there are several you can get online, but I wanted to use one that was in the public domain. And this shows, in very small type, unfortunately, all the different tribes that are located throughout the United States. And there are about 565, I think possibly 566 now. I can't remember exactly which one of those two numbers it is. But there are so many, and they have their own ability to create law, and about half of them have adopted their own court systems. All of the federally recognized tribes have the power to do that. It's just that not all of them have exercised that power. So what do I mean by a federally recognized tribe? Well, there are more tribes than that. There are more indigenous peoples than that within the boundaries of the United States. But these are the tribes that have been recognized by the federal government for purposes of federal law, for purposes of recognizing their sovereignty, and a number of other federal programs. It's very complex, so I won't get into too many of the details about that. But before I go on further, I used the words American Indian up at the top of the slide, and I just wanted to pause for a moment, and also the words tribes and tribal law. I wanted to pause for just a moment to talk about some of the naming issues that may come up when you take the step of introducing this material in your class, because as we get into the rest of the material, there may not be as much time to stop and talk about it. So one of the issues that tends to arise is that, especially for those of us who are not members of a Native American community, it's always a little risky when you kind of step out and start naming other cultures and people. But it's a fairly accepted term in what we would call Indian country, in other words, in Native America, in the land and among the peoples who identify as Native American. To refer to themselves as American Indian, also as Native American. Even the word Indian on its own, which in the past has been used so pejoratively by outsider populations, at least within Native American communities, is often used freely, and it's also a term of art in federal law. If you explain those kinds of things to your students, or at least just mention them, it's probably okay to go ahead and use those terms. With the word Indian alone, when it's not modified by American Indian, I would just be maybe a little bit more careful to explain that you're using it as a term of art, just in case there are students in your class who may identify with those communities and be a little bit concerned that you may not be using it appropriately. Tribes and tribal law are also very well accepted terms, although increasingly the word nation is used much more frequently as a way of recognizing that tribes do have sovereignty. And I'll get into the nature of that sovereignty in just a moment. What I usually do is look to the name of the particular tribe that I'm talking about, if there is one, because usually in their own name that they've adopted, that they've taken for themselves, sometimes those names were given historically, but often they're also taken. They may choose whether to use the word tribe or nation, and you can just follow suit. Okay, so that's an interesting map, and you can kind of see the whole progress of westward expansion there when you look at it. The reason why you don't see as many larger land bases for American Indian communities in the East is because, if you may recall some of your American history, tribes were pushed westward with westward expansion. That's a very long and tortured, literally tortured history in some ways that's very worth reading about when you do have a minute, and I'll touch upon a little bit of it as we go along. Okay. Why introduce tribal nations in courts in LARW? Some of you may have been coming to the webinar today with that question in mind. It seems like a really big topic to bite off when you're just have so much to do and the students are so new and our course is so jam-packed and so front-loaded. And I think that there are a lot of reasons. First of all, it can really help you to teach some of those foundational U.S. legal system concepts in that first couple of days of class that are so pivotal. It can also really, really help to send important messages to the students about priorities in social justice, in professionalism, and in multicultural awareness, which is so important for communicating with clients and with judges and all kinds of other actors in the community. And so those are some of the major reasons. And so let's go ahead and get into some practical applications. All right, so there are a number of ways that you can use this material. You can use it to talk about federalism. A lot of students come to law school with really only the most rudimentary understanding from, their 8th grade civics class, even though they were probably exposed to a lot more information than that. What they really remember is kind of the standard, states forming the federal government, the original 13 colonies and all that sort of thing. And the whole history of American Indian government and society is really left out of it, and any mention of these vibrant hundreds of other governments that exist on within U.S. boundaries is really omitted in most curriculums. You can really use it very effectively to talk about sources of law. In other words, where does primary law come from? Having another type of government to compare state and federal to is very illustrative. Selecting authority is probably, for lack of a better word, the coolest way that you can use tribal law in the early days of LARW. It's really kind of amazing for studying some of those trickier questions of how do you know which authorities to use, especially when you have an issue from one government, say the state of Kansas, and you are litigating that issue in the federal court system. When you add in the tribal comparative model, it really, really illuminates the whole process, and students really get it a lot more quickly. It helps to promote professional respect for legal institutions, because one of the most egregious oversights that we have is the way that people treat and think of tribal courts when they are exposed to them. increases students for the reality that they really are very likely to end up in tribal court or to have an Indian law issue cross their desk in many, many different areas of practice, especially with increased socioeconomic integration of tribal communities and other local areas. It helps to send the message about social justice. I'll get into that more later, which is such an important part, most people would argue, I think, of the law school mission, or at least many of us in LARW and clinic would. It enhances transfer of learning and also increases multicultural awareness. So we can think of the federal system as being a three-sovereign system, and other writers have called it a tri-sovereign system, a tri-federal system. Those are all kind of neat ways of describing it. And so I tend to think of it as a Venn diagram because each of the different types of government in our system have their own internal law, and they also have areas where their law either conflicts with or runs up against the law of the other sovereigns, and because of that there's often natural confusion about which law should apply. But I think the part of this model that really gets overlooked is the Native American part, I think because of curriculum design. It's just really not considered to be important enough to mention, and so most of us come to the table not even really thinking about it. Where does that sovereignty come from? Well, it depends on how you look at it, but it comes from a number of different places. It comes from the inherent sovereignty of tribes. It comes from a concept called cultural sovereignty. In other words, it's not just, as most people would think, a sovereignty that was bestowed upon tribes by the federal government. It actually comes from the peoples themselves. And if you think of international law concepts of sovereignty, it has a lot, perhaps more in common with that model in the sense that these are populations that were treated as international powers back when settlers were not so powerful, and they have their own rights of self-determination that have now been recognized by international law with the now 5-year-old UN Declaration on the Right of Indigenous Peoples. And so they were also recognized by treaty and by a whole other lot of different types of instruments. But I think the one that really gets overlooked is the inherent sovereignty of a people to chart their own course through history and into the future and pass their knowledge and their experience and their culture down to the next generations. And that's part of what's now been finally recognized in international law. They are limited sovereigns in the sense that they are now within United States boundaries, and some of their original inherent sovereignty has either been ceded to the United States by treaty or was taken by force. And I've got a picture of the painting of Manifest Destiny there. And when you go to the materials later, if you choose to download the materials for this presentation, I also have notes available under each of these slides, and I'd be happy to email them to anyone who would like them that explain how to use some of these materials in class. I think the painting is particularly vivid for showing how the United States legal system developed, in the sense that how the United States government and settlement developed. And unfortunately, I don't have enough time to get into that now. But I think you can see just from the picture there all of the philosophy and religion and other aspects of culture that go into the way that we thought of our rights to settle these territories. And so these are limited sovereigns, and yet that inherent sovereignty still remains, which is pretty unique actually in the world system, because in most other countries that political and legal sovereignty isn't still recognized. There's a huge variety of organizational structures in tribal government. Sometimes there's separation of powers and sometimes there's not, and that's really controversial for a number of reasons, but it can make for a really interesting discussion of the legal system with your students and help them to see why separation of powers can be so important, and also how sometimes different cultural values can change how important that is and whether that's really enough of a priority for tribes to always have to use that system, which they don't. Introducing these materials can also promote respect for legal institutions. There's a rich common law tradition developing in tribal courts. They have, of course, their own case law, just like any other court system, that incorporates custom and tradition, which traditionally, of course, was oral law into written law, and that can help you to show how the common law developed in the United States and of course, in England and in Anglo-American legal institutions. with economic development, tribal communities and economies are integrating with state and local economies and with national and international too. I've got links here that you can explore later to two of the more successful tribes in terms of their economic achievements. And you can see that they're doing business on an international level. They're contracting with the United States government. They're providing cellular service to the military, all kinds of amazing things, as well as having little homegrown businesses in their area as well that serve the local needs. And so because of that, our students are going to be entering into transactions for their clients with tribes. They may be working for tribes. That's a great area for employment in these tough economic times. And also they're going to be in tribal court and in federal and state court on tribal and federal Indian law issues. So I'm running short on time, so I'll just mention that sending these messages in the first week of law school is important to promoting the social justice mission, because when we don't mention these things right at the beginning, when we as professors are not talking about them, that first week when students kind of imprint on what's important in legal education, if they're not getting those messages, then they tend to devalue them for the rest of their education. And finally, looking at comparative models helps to enhance transfer of learning. And my notes for these slides will help you to explore these things further if you're interested. And the last slide is just that when we talk about these issues in class, it's a great segue into what hopefully will become some more multiculturally aware, diverse exercises, like the research exercises that Tamara will talk about, and writing assignments that help students to see how important these skills are to providing good service to our clients. And I'll pick up later when we talk about applications in class to go over the selecting authority module with you.
Great, Tanya, thank you so much. And as Tanya said, we're going to, in a few minutes after we talk a little bit about research, hit on some of the ways in which you might incorporate some of these into your class. But now we're going to go to Professor Herrera. Can you hear me? Professor, let me unmute you. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I can, and let me turn the screen over to you.
Perfect. Do you see my screen now?
I do.
I sound like a bad commercial, don't I?
Yes, we do. We said we won't name the commercial, though.
Good. Well, thank you so much for having me and for everybody who's listening. I am sorry for those who know me that I don't sound like me today. I am getting over like the world's worst flu/cold here in Arizona and 100 degrees, so I apologize for that. But what I'm going to cover next is the tribal law research idea and how I incorporated the ideas that Tanya was just talking about through research exercises. I've since spun off the research exercises into a separate course, which Kirsten mentioned at the beginning, and it's been quite popular with students both in our Indian legal program and those who are not in the program. And it's taken me a while to come up with an approach that's efficient for finding tribal constitutions, codes, and opinions, because it's not the easiest area to research, which truthfully was one of the reasons I stayed away from introducing this earlier in my teaching career. The definition of tribal law, we've talked a little bit about that. I mentioned to students when I teach this that this definition isn't set, that there are many definitions. I usually say it's the law that a sovereign tribal body creates to govern itself and its members, also including that law that applies within that sovereign's boundaries. That's just one of the many that you can find. But I like to have something that the students can start with when we talk about what it is that we're looking for. We then brainstorm what could these sources of tribal law be. Most of them get cases and constitutions and codes. Some may mention treaties when we do this as an in-class exercise where we're brainstorming. Nobody gets intergovernmental agreements. Nobody gets administrative law. And tradition and custom, it's been hit or miss over the last few years that I do this. So I like doing this as a group exercise to see what do we all know and what was kind of unexpected about where the sources of tribal law would come from. To be honest, and I'm going to focus this presentation here, the focus is just going to be on constitutions, codes, and cases, which is where the students' minds go, because those are the sources most familiar to the students. They're the ones that I can expect them to grapple with in the first year, and because we've moved some of these other topics to another course in our second year, but I do like to introduce the other sources of tribal law to them. So what are the challenges to researching tribal law? Tanya touched on probably the largest challenge is the fact that there's no uniform system of how tribes conduct business or have their court systems laid out or their governmental systems laid out, plus the sheer large number, over 500 federally recognized tribes. When there's no uniform system like we expect, like all students, right? If you're thinking like our students, so thinking Westlaw or Lexis and everything looks the same, makes it hard to update if there's no uniform system or uniform way to collect these things. Because not all tribal law is in electronic format. Most of what we find is still in print format, and most of it, even in print format, doesn't necessarily circulate anywhere. So there's no one major collection that you can always go to, although there's been lots of improvement on that front. I would say even in the last 5 years that I've been teaching this, lots of improvement. So those are some of the challenges to researching tribal law. So anyone who knows me knows I love to boil things down into steps. And so I have come up with these 3 steps to efficient research for tribal constitutions. And you'll see these 3 steps again as I go on in the presentation. But this is what the 3 steps are. First, if you know the tribe's official website, I always suggest that students start there. And if you're not quite sure, step 2 might help you with that, and a little bit of self-promotion for our wonderful librarians in our Ross Blakely Law Library. They've created an Indian law portal, which has gotten a lot of national attention and is linked with a lot of tribal law court resources. And so I've provided the link for you, and I'll show you some of those pages. But any kind of law portal that collects information, Harvard and Minnesota also have wonderful research guides that I've used before that collects the information so that you can look to see which tribes have, for instance, an official website. So I'd look at a website, then some sort of portal or research guide, and then lastly, there are some websites that are collecting this information. The National Indian Law Library has collected this information, and the Tribal Court Clearinghouse. So this is just an example of what one of the tribes, this is a tribe local here to Arizona, what one of their websites might look like. I show this to students because I want them to see that maybe it's not a searchable site, that there won't be the annotations that we're hopefully all teaching them well during these first few weeks of the class, and that there's no particular way to see how maybe updated the document is, but that the document can be searched by table of contents or titles. So it's useful to show them a series of these websites. This is what, if you go through the ASU, Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law homepage and click on the very top up here is the link to the Law Library. This is what the Law Library's web homepage looks like. And on the right side of our page, we have the law portals that our librarians have been working on. And if you click on the Indian Law portal link, it's going to take you to a page which lays out all the options, I think, quite clearly. Any kind of books, if you're searching by subject, because one of the things I'm not talking about today are all the rich secondary sources on tribal law. And that could be a whole other webinar in and of itself. And I have had students search for that in class 2. And this is a great place to start. The 2 links I will show you, though, are the tribal law for tribes located in Arizona and those not located in Arizona. Those are the most helpful for first years if you're doing a research project. For tribes located in Arizona, I won't click on that link, but it comes up as a table with active links that take you right to the information. Or if there are inactive links, it's usually to, I say, a call number in the library where you can find the print material. So I'm going to click on, this is what it would look like if I clicked on how do I find information for tribes outside of Arizona. You'll see it gives some links to some library websites that are really helpful, including the Tribal Courts Directory. But really, it's here at the bottom, these free web sources, which are my step 3 on my 3-step process, that this portal reminds you to go to. Taking a look at the National Indian Law Library and the Tribal Court Clearinghouse. So there's lots of information to be had. If I were to click on the National Indian Law Library, this is what would come up. We have caught the National Indian Law Library this week in the middle of moving all of their information. So unfortunately, I can't show you some of the things I would have liked to have shown you. It's a wonderful website, and they're just reorganizing everything into a new format. But what's really helpful if you go through this tribal law gateway at the top of the National Indian Law Library page is it brings up this page, which shows you a variety of ways to research the same information. It really gets to us, to all of us who have different approaches to research. On the left-hand side where the blue arrow is are alphabetical lists of tribes. That's particularly helpful. On the other side of the page, you can Google everything. So for the Google generation, that's a particularly helpful search box. The how to find pages, where the blue arrow is pointing now, are really detailed pages prepared by David Stetson, who is the librarian there, and he's also got videos that you can watch about how to do the research. I play the videos in class sometimes if I have time because they're particularly helpful. He also has, as you can see in the bottom of that box, a research tip guide, which is really helpful, and it's just been updated this year. If you scroll to the bottom of the page, you'll notice where the blue arrow is, there's a tribal law drafting guide. So for those who are teaching drafting, maybe you don't have time to talk about tribal law in first-year courses. I'm kicking around how to deal with tribal law in my advanced courses when I teach drafting. And here's some information for that. There's an Ask NIL button, which the librarian answers. And then the red box on the right side of the page are all of the links you can see to Tribal Court Clearinghouse, to the ASU Indian Law Portal, the Tribal Law Journal, and other sources that are helpful. If I were to click on the specific page about how to research codes and ordinances, for example, this is what the page would look like, and I'm just showing you a quick example of one. I won't click on this for every source, but you can see the embedded links here for the videos. It takes you to the index, reminds you that you can Google search, but more importantly, in this gray box, it tells you some of the codes are available at NIL, but they're not online. You can search their table of contents online, but you can't actually get the document online. It may be that the document you're seeking is in a room that looks like this room. This picture was taken from a librarian conference a couple of years ago about from the NIL offices, the library office, and how their ordinances are collected, their binders of material. And the librarian there is really helpful about photocopying things that you might need. I show this picture and I get gasps from students because they're hoping I'm not going to make them look through that information. This is the Tribal Court Clearinghouse page. Same information for the most part that NIL has because they work together. But under this tribal law links, you would find all of this information, and we could click on the Tribal Constitutions link and find the list of all the tribal constitutions that this website contains. Another helpful website for tribal constitutions is the Native American Constitution Digitization Project at the University of Oklahoma. It has a lot of the same information. You'll find a lot of these are repeated amongst these three websites, but each has a little bit unique coverage. The unique coverage here with Oklahoma is that they organize the IRA, the Indian Reorganization Act, constitutions together. So if you were involved with some sort of project where you're dealing with tribes who have an IRA constitution, this is a particularly helpful website to go to. A lot of tribes are now engaging in some rewriting of constitutions, and this is where I would send them to take a look. And there we go. Here's the page with all the IRA-era constitutions and charters put together. Tribal code should be no surprise. I have the same 3 steps, so I don't have to walk you through those pages again, but I will show you quickly. The Tribal Court Clearinghouse page has some really interesting stuff, the unique materials. It has some articles about drafting tribal codes and tribal laws. It collects, for instance, down here, tribal law code resources, all the domestic violence laws. So it's a great place if you've got students working on particular paper topics dealing with tribal law. I send them to Tribal Court Clearinghouse to see if someone has done some of that work for them already. Here are the codes on this page. If you just keep scrolling down the page, you'd see the codes that are available on Tribal Court Clearinghouse. And even farther down the page, You would see sample or model codes, which again could be used in a drafting course, and they're very interesting and added to all the time. This page has changed significantly since I even taught this class in the spring of 2012. So those are some of the unique features. And again, the University of Oklahoma has some unique coverage because it contains archived superseded codes, which you can see right there. I've only had to use those once in a research project, but I thought it was particularly helpful that somebody was keeping at least some of them. That's good to know that. A final word on constitutions and codes. I rarely need to pay for this research, and I would only use Versus Law, Westlaw, or Lexis as a last resort. A lot of students will default thinking they should use these because they need to update the material they're going to find, but there really is not much updating that can be done on these sites. Just by way of information, here are the 22 tribal courts systems that have information on Versus Law, which differ from, this is the list that's on Westlaw, versus this is the list from Lexis, which are mainly the Montana codes. So you can see none of these pay services have as much, perhaps, as some of the free services do, but it's a good idea just to check to see whichever tribe you're interested in where their information is kept. Finally, tribal court opinions, the same 3 steps. Not much of a surprise there. There are tribal court reporters. The National Indian Law Library has created a cumulative subject index for the Indian Law Reporter that you can find on that website and can download and use. It's really helpful. So if you know your library contains that. There's also West American Tribal Law Reporter with the tribes I have listed here in it. Our library has gone through some discussion about whether to get this particular system or not, or these reporters or not, because of the cost. So it's a good opportunity to have this discussion with students too. Finally, the place I send most everybody for tribal court opinions, because this is where the links on the ASU portal send you, the links on the National Indian Law Library send you, are to the Tribal Court Clearinghouse. It's a searchable page in connection with Versus Law. For the 22 tribal courts that we just looked at a few slides ago, you can word search, you can do some Boolean searching, and then they also have, I guess what we call Head Notes Lite, some predefined search terms that you can search under. For instance, all the tribal materials or tribal cases on membership you could pull up by using those predefined search terms. When is your research done with tribal law? Generally, in practice, only after contacting the tribe to make sure you have the updated information. I tell students keep great notes of where you've looked, keep notes of who you've talked to. I don't actually require students to take this step, but we say if you're going to work in this area, and we have a clinic where they will have this direct experience, that it's important that they know this last step. Here's the great benefit I found about, and I should have started with this benefit, right? Start with your thesis. But the great benefit for introducing tribal law research for me has been I've taken the tribal law research and made great analogies to municipal and city code research, which is another area that doesn't get touched on much, if at all, in law school. And we talk about how the sheer number of these kinds of laws is large, that there's no uniform system. For instance, if I want the Scottsdale Fire Code, might not be in the same place that the City of Phoenix's fire code is kept. And most municipal laws like this are not electronically kept, and I have to physically get to a library to use these resources. So that's how I introduce research on tribal law to first-year students. I do this between maybe papers, or sometimes you have that strange class where something doesn't fit, and this is a good way to bring lots of discussion back together. So I've used it in lots of different places. Now I think I'm the one tapped with keeping us moving along. Moving to the next section of our presentation, and I think I'm right on time for that, is how to integrate these ideas in class with more specific examples instead of just, you should do this, it's great. I do this by way of actual research questions that I have students go and do. So I just wanted to share a few examples with you before I turn this back to Tanya to talk about some more other ideas for introducing tribal law code and law, or tribal law into class. Here's my idea, and I do this one regularly for introducing constitutions and codes. You can do a simple, what I call the treasure hunt exercise. Find out what information, resources you have in your library for tribal law, and have them go locate it. Make them walk up to the second floor of the library, touch the Navajo Nation Code, open to the chapter table of contents, and actually find that, oh, look, there is a motor vehicle code, and there are laws about how to enforce speeding. I don't expect them to do analysis or answer any questions. This really is just a hunt and find. But I have done analysis questions, and here's an example of that, where I might ask a question saying, for instance, this corporation wants to open a shop by leasing some land, and the land is actually zoned, and students sometimes are surprised to see that there might be zoning law involved with tribes. So can this corporation lease the land, and can they fight the zoning to be able to perhaps put up the type of shop that they would like? This kind of exercise question is one I used last year, and to find the answer, they have to go, for instance, to the Tribal Law Gateway to look up the tribe's law. They have to look at both the Constitution and the Code, because the Constitution addresses the land issue while the Code addresses the zoning issue. So it's another nice reminder about how all of this works together, and you have to look for every piece of the puzzle. For cases, I usually just ask a basic question, such as, is the Navajo Education and Scholarship Foundation a tribal entity or a private nonprofit corporation? Again, they could use the Tribal Court Clearinghouse to do this research. It forces them a good reminder of their research skills, keywords, and Boolean searches to find the case that answers the question. So those are just some examples. I have more if anyone would like them. My contact information is on the first page of the PowerPoint, so please email me and let me know if you'd like any more specific research exercises. I have both basic for first year and more advanced for my advanced course. So
Thank you.
I'll turn it back to you to turn to Tanya.
Okay, great. Thank you, Tamara. Tanya, I'm going to turn the screen over to you for some more suggestions for incorporating this into class.
Thank you, and I'll try to speak up a little bit better this time. Okay, so the main application for class that I was hoping to highlight today was the Selecting Authority module, which of course is something that almost all of us teach in the first 1 to 3 classes of that, all important for beginning of the semester in the first year. And so here's kind of the sequence that I'll walk you through. Introducing the tri-federal system to students, because that's usually news to them, as it was to me when I was well, I didn't even get exposed to it as a law student. It was news to me as an attorney. How you can use this material to introduce sources of law, how you can use this material to get to the really key question in selecting authority, which is this bifold question. First, what law binds the court, and then, because it can be different, what law governs the issue, and I'll get into that in just a moment. And then also, how do you ultimately weave all this information together to get at the core concepts that underlie selecting authority. And the reason I started doing this was because I wanted to find originally just to find a cool way to mention tribal courts and governments and law in the first year, because I was so disappointed that I hadn't known about it and was so scared of all the malpractice I might have committed. But then I came to realize that it actually is a really valid and exciting way of teaching this subject. And I think my students learn it 10 times better because they don't just memorize rules about selecting authority, they actually understand the dynamics that gave rise to the way that we select authority. They understand the why instead of just the how, and that's what's so cool about it. And I should have mentioned last time, Terry McMurtry-Chubb has a great book which is Legal Writing in the Disciplines, and she actually has a tri-sovereign system diagram in her book, and she also talks about it a bit. So again, so if you want to take a look at her example, again, that's Legal Writing in the Disciplines. So I recommend taking a look. But here's just that nice little simple Venn diagram chart that you can use again with your students to introduce the concept of how there are actually 3 different types of sovereign government in the United States. I usually start by saying how many how many governments do we have within the United States? I just say governments. I don't even talk about sovereignty yet. And usually people will say either 1, which is the United States, Or they'll say, well, it's 51 because there's the 50 states and there's also the federal government. And some people say, well, we also have municipal governments. And then I kind of just, do the whole blow your mind thing by saying, well, there's actually this many hundred, there's over 600 if you count the Native American nations, the state, and that just blows their mind. And so that's a kind of you've got them at that point. They're awake, they're listening, they want to know more. So that's a neat way to introduce. And then I use that to jump into sources of law. So in other words, I think one of the biggest problems that students run into is that, of course, as we all know, our first-year curriculum is so case-centric that all they're thinking about is cases, cases, cases. That's the only source of law. And that's what their go-to, and our colleagues in the clinic are always saying they always forget to use secondary sources. They don't think about statutes, right? And that's because of this emphasis in the first-year curriculum. And so what I try to train them to do is whenever you're looking for law, think about the three branches of government. Those are the three branches in most systems at least, and of course I've already mentioned that tribes can differ greatly and how great the variety is and how it can be actually kind of cool. But at least in the state and federal system and in many tribes we have that three-branch system, judicial, legislative, executive, and we walk through all the different types of law that those can create, including more than what you see on the chart here. And I have a much more fleshed out chart that I'll have available for the website that has all different types of sources of law, including some of the more arcane. But so this gets them thinking, oh, it's not just cases, it's statutes, it's regulations, and we talk about how they all come together into a big mix that gets applied to the client's legal issue. And then I use tribal codes as an example, and I talk about how, like in Kansas, you would have the Kansas statutes. At Prairie Band Potawatomi Nation, you'd have the Prairie Band Potawatomi Nation Law and Order Code, and in U.S. Congress, you'd have the United States Code, and how depending on the legal issue, it's not always the United States or the state code that governs. It could be the tribal code, and that helps people to understand that really the three governments kind of operate side by side. It's not, even though in some ways it's top down with the federal government because it's so powerful, that there are plenty of areas of law where it's only really the tribal law that matters or the state law that matters, and the federal law or the state law has no role. And that's kind of hard for them to grasp at first because they think, well, really the federal government just weighs in on everything. And of course we know that that's not true. Even though they may try, it's not always the way that it works. And so there's a really neat court chart that actually Sam Moppet, who I think is listening today, she found when we did a presentation on this at LWI a few years ago. And I'll go ahead and provide that with the materials too. So thank you, Sam, for that. It's a great chart. And then so now we get into dividing the question of selecting authority into the two avenues that you kind of need to explore to answer the question, because it's not always what students would assume, which is what law binds the court, which is sort of that classic going up the chain of command, going up the path of appeal answer. Because, and this is what, as you know, of course, all of you, totally blows their minds, is that you can have a state law question in tribal court, you can have a federal law question in state court, and it's okay, and it's not weird, and it happens every single day, and that you can have questions from multiple governments in the same case, and that's totally normal. And so they have to be able to decide each other's questions, and so we just talk about how that's a matter of judicial economy, and you don't want to have multiple litigation going on at the same time for the same case. It's expensive and crazy, and you'll get different results, and nobody will know what to do. Chaos in the streets. And so I talk about sovereignty to explain why different governments have the power to create their own law. And so, in other words, it comes from that original inherent power that those governments had before the federal system came into being. States had sovereignty before they created the United States. Those 13 colonies, they created their own law, and they had that original sovereignty of, if you kind of ignore the whole problem of that was actually Indian land, we won't get into that too much, even though it's very relevant here. And I mention this to the students because it gets them thinking. If you ignore the fact that the states used the doctrine of discovery to take over those territories, in the Western way of thinking, they were there first, so they had that original sovereignty, and that gave them the power to create law and then to create the federal government, which they then imbued with some of their power to create law. And it's similar for the tribes, even though it's not the same. By treaty, they retain that power. By their inherent cultural sovereignty and right to self-determination, they retain that power. And also by keeping some of that sovereignty that they didn't give up in a treaty or wasn't taken from them by force through the process of colonization. They have that power. And so that's why we have all these different governments that can create law. And so we have to think whose law will govern the issue. And that's really helps them to see, oh, okay, so it's not just which court system I'm in, but which government's law originated the legal question, and that's whose law we're going to look for. And of course, we all know that choice of law is totally complicated, but that's a little bit too much for them right away. And then finally, you can end with really talking about this, getting them to solve the problem. In other words, so now we're getting into problem-solving mode, and which is a great way for them to learn this material instead of just trying to memorize rules or just listen to you talking. And so you can break them into small groups and have them tackle this problem that's on the screen. What do you do if you're in state court and you have an issue of federal law? And of course, the same type of problem for all these, for the other three columns. Notice also that I've placed these the governments on the same level of hierarchy. I did that in purpose. I didn't want to lower tribes down below because sometimes their law is paramount and it's not the federal or state law that controls. And I also didn't put tribes on one end of the chart or the other because I didn't want to suggest that they were the least important, that they came last or that they came first because they were the smallest or the least important. So all these things are kind of little messages that students may not even realize that they're receiving in the way that this material is presented. And so finally, I let them work in small groups to discover for themselves how it would be. And of course, a lot of those small groups will get the question wrong, but a lot of them get it right. And so then in the class discussion that follows, we can talk about how governments, how court systems, when they're looking at the law of another sovereign, so maybe federal law looking at a state law question, what do you do if there isn't law on that issue? Can the federal court do anything? And of course the answer is they have to try to answer the question the way that the highest court of that state would, even if the state hasn't spoken on the issue yet. And that just blows their minds completely. And it ends up being a really fun class. Having that third tribal example makes it more interesting. It wakes them up. It's not boring. It's got culture. It's got variety. And it helps to provide a comparative model and what it does is by adding that extra example for application of these models that we're giving them, it shows them that the model has validity. In other words, you're not just applying it once to a state or a federal issue, you're applying it again in this unique context that they've never seen before, and that they can see that even though there are some differences, the model holds up, and that's what's so neat about it. And so I'll go ahead and stop there so that we can do our Q&A.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Tanya. And I just want to make sure, are we ready to move on to the Q&A?
Good question.
Tamara, was there anything?
Nothing else.
Okay, great. I just want to make sure I didn't cut anybody off. And so I've had some questions coming in, and I would encourage anyone else out there who still has questions to please send them on to me through the question and answer box. But one of the first questions is this: if someone wanted to do some background reading on Indian law, so they wanted to teach this in their section but kind of wanted to get a deeper understanding, what kind of source would you suggest for someone who's a novice?
This is Tanya talking. I would actually suggest going to Sam Moffat's article first because she wrote an absolutely amazing primer on a lot of these issues that really will help people who feel uncomfortable with this topic to get their bearings so that you know more than what you're telling the students, but enough so that you feel confident and you can answer any questions that students might come up with. That would be my first place that I would recommend, although there's a lot of other really great shorter articles available online too, and I'll provide a bibliography as well for that.
Great. Tamara, any others that you can think of? Tamara?
As long as you all promise not to laugh at me. Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Sorry.
You can. Okay, no laughing at me. One of the first things I did, because I didn't realize all of these sources were out there, I didn't think law review articles, is I read the nutshell before I had to teach this class the first time. And actually the nutshell on federal Indian law, I also read some other companion pieces, were really helpful in just knowing the major cases that were out there and the major doctrines. So I recommend that too.
Great.
And it's funny, the nutshell is actually considered to be a pretty authoritative source, which it usually isn't, but for Indian law, it's such a good one, and it was written by a federal judge, Judge Canby, and it's actually very well regarded in the field.
Okay, here's another question for you. Is there some place to find a pronunciation guide for the names of tribes and other Native American words?
Oh, that's a good one. You might want to go to the tribe's website because often they'll provide the anglicized name and also the traditional pronunciation. And if that fails, I would just call somebody down at the clerk's office or what have you because they're so lovely and they're always glad when people care enough to ask.
I agree. I don't know of any universal source collecting them all, and I've been recently. If there is one, it would probably be on the NIL site, the Indian Law Library, or the Bureau of Indian Affairs, but I've not seen anything.
Okay. And you mentioned earlier, I think it was the Tribal Law Reporter that Westlaw prints. Is that also available, or that West prints? Is it also available on Westlaw?
Ooh, tough question. For a while it wasn't. It was not included. I guess the short answer to this question is it's going to depend on what subscription your law library has made with Westlaw. For a while it was in our basic educational package, and then it was not for several years, which caused some angst amongst those who practice in the area at our school and our Indian Legal Clinic. As I understand the issue now, we've managed to negotiate it back. So it's a hard question to answer in the abstract. It's there. Most of the stuff is there, but whether you have access to it in your school might be a different thing.
And then the final question I have, unless someone wants to send me another, is what if someone were wanting to design a bigger problem around either a federal Indian law question or a tribal law question, what are some of the issues that you see right now that are kind of emerging areas of interest for specific tribal law or federal Indian law issues that you can think of? That's a tough one off the top of your heads, I know.
I grapple with this is Tanya, every spring because I have decided over the last few years to incorporate a federal Indian law problem every spring because it's such a great area because it has federal law in the form of code, case law, and regulations, and so they get that experience of having to work with the CFRs and get a broader spectrum of sources of law. Plus it's great for building multicultural awareness and the problems, the fact patterns are so interesting. I actually watch the blogs. The best one is called Turtle Talk, and that's Matthew Fletcher's blog from Michigan State. It's incredibly powerful. They post several times a day. They always have, whenever they talk about a case that's pending, they'll post documents from that case, pleadings, briefs. And I go, I'll start watching a few months ahead of time, and when I find one that I think sounds interesting, I will go and pull the file off of PACER, which is the public access to records site for the federal courts, and I actually assign my students an entire appellate record, which I know is mean and cruel, but they usually are really glad that we did it. And it gives an authentic case, which they get super excited about because they're working on a real, honest-to-goodness case. They love that, and they get the experience of having to slog through transcripts and a record. If it's a massive case, I'll just pick like one element of one cause of action to narrow it down, and all kinds of things like that. And Barbara Blumenfeld has a good article. She's at UNM and teaches legal writing on how she designs. I think she writes her own problems, and she talks about how she designs problems based on federal Indian law. And I'll make sure that citation is in the bibliography.
Okay, great. Tamara, anything to add on that?
I have nothing to add. If you're looking for some major big subjects, ones that have worked for me have been the Indian Child Welfare Act, ICWA, and the Civil Rights Act as well, Indian Civil Rights Act, which is ICRA. Both of those are big topics that you can start by just looking up the statutes and maybe backing into something.
Okay, great.
And I often use, it's actually a federal statute, Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which many of you may be familiar with, so RFRA, because it has a lot of really cool religious freedom and cultural issues that you can analyze under a pretty straightforward federal statute, but it brings in some Indian law issues as well.
Well, I see that we are running up against our time, so I would like to thank our presenters, Professor Kowalski, Professor Herrera. Thank you so much, both of you, for joining us today, and to our audience, thank you as well for joining us. When you sign off today, you will see a short survey, a couple of questions. If you'd answer those would be really helpful to me in organizing these for the future. And again, thank you to you both. We'll be posting the PowerPoints and the handouts that Tanya talked about with the recorded presentation on our website. And if you have any questions about this, please don't hesitate to contact me, or if you want to contact our presenters directly, I know they'd be happy to talk to you too. And just so you know, we're seeing lots of thank you, and that this was great. So presenters, thank you so much. And from Gulfport, Florida, have a great day. Bye-bye.